And Clarissa, we would love to hear more about the Latino Vote Initiative that you are leading. Just wanting to know how do people plug in? And so first, if you want to just share a little bit about what are you doing, and then how are you plugging into the community, and how can the community plug into you?
Sure thing. And I wanted to add, for folks who are watching, you may be thinking, okay, I do interact with 18-year-olds or younger Latinos, but maybe it's more their kids or older adults in the adult education classes. Here's the thing, right? So indeed, we have 1 million Latino US citizens turning 18 every year and becoming eligible to register, then vote. But we also have more than 13 million already eligible and in need of registration who run the gamut of age and experience. So chances are, if you work with a Latino community, there are folks there who are eligible and in need of registration. And sometimes, right, it may be like Camille was saying, somebody who might be undocumented, but there are members in the family who are citizens, or the person who is not yet a citizen or not yet 18 may be out there providing the information for their family. The phone tree has changed, but the new phone, but some of those things we used to do haven't, right? So we do rely a lot on word of mouth and family and friends for recommendations and to navigate things. Instead of using the phone tree, now we use WhatsApp, right? Instead of going door to door, now we check into our favorite channel, or instead of, the means have changed, but in some ways, the tradition of checking with folks and getting eso de, corre la voz, that's still very much in play. And so for us at Unidos US, for those of you who are not familiar, we are the nation's largest civil rights and advocacy, or Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. And I like to say that we work through 3 Ps: programs, policy, and people. And people, in addition to our staff, is a network of community-based organizations that together serve millions of immigrants and citizens alike every year. Now, the Latino Vote Initiative came together because while Unidos has been doing work in the civic engagement space for a long time, whether legislatively, in some cases, and/or helping folks register and get out to the polls, through that time, we have also seen that there are a lot of misconceptions and mistaken assumptions about this electorate. So the Latino Vote Initiative really is an effort to establish a more accurate understanding about Hispanic voters and their priorities, to really try to inform greater investment in engaging with these voters and more effective engagement. And then, of course, it goes without saying, the other part of the Latino Vote Initiative is to make sure that we're working with our community to increase its own political agency doing voter registration and get out the vote, but also looking at other mechanisms that can help us really tackle this voter registration opportunity gap, whether it is working for schools, with schools directly, or with registrars of voters or secretaries of state. But again, with so many Latinos out there eligible, and right now, as voter registration deadlines are coming to an end in a lot of locations, thinking about heading out to the polls. The other thing that is bien Latino, no, yo estaba diciendo el otro día, we don't like to do things alone. And if you think about it, voting can be a lonely act, right? Like there's you in the voting booth, solito. And I don't know about you all, but I'm a naturalized citizen. I was formerly undocumented, and the first time I voted, like I didn't know how it worked, so I went with someone, and I always do to this day. So be a friend and go with someone who might be a first-time voter so that they can feel at ease and welcome in their polling location and encourage them to vote early.
Fantastic. I love that idea. And we are like, yeah, spoiler alert, we are going to get back to that voting plan a little later in this webinar. So hold that thought.
And
You
by
can
the
sort of
way,
be
Mary, one thing I was gonna say is
yeah.
I know I'll we'll share this information with you, but if
Mhm.
folks go to the Unidos voting page, there is a section with tools for voters, including nonpartisan voter guides, because that's one thing that we get a lot of questions about. ¿Y por quién voto? Now we're doing this work on the nonpartisan side, so we cannot tell people that, but these are nonpartisan voter guides, and people really want more information. So you can find a section for voters, including a voter hotline there that our great sister organization Naleo runs. And you can also go to the Hispanic Electorate Data Hub we created if you're looking for statistics about this electorate from the national to the state to the congressional district level, in addition to what are the issues top of mind for these voters.
That's perfect. And we'll be sending out to folks who have registered as well as on social media. We'll be sharing those links that each of you have so that we can we can keep expanding the work that you're doing and get it in the hands of more people. Sonia, one of those things we would like to do with you as well. We'd love to hear more about the Latina Futures 2050 lab and how you are engaging in this election and the approach you took to engaging in this election.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think this election, more than 2016, really is focusing at the intersection of Latina life in this country because race and ethnicity, as well as gender, are paramount in shaping outcomes and opinions and actions. And I think that we're seeing that in the gender gap across generational statuses, especially with our youngest generation, most diverse generation, that is voting age Gen Z. You see a sharp difference in terms of Gen Z people that identify as women and their preference for Kamala Harris compared to Gen Z male voters and their preference for Donald Trump. Gender matters. And what we're talking about here when we're talking about Latina voters and the candidate that is Vice President Kamala Harris is we're talking about women of color. And those are experiences within the context of the United States of America which has a socio-political kind of, if you would say, constraint system around opportunity, around gender parity. On October 3rd of this year, it was Latina Equal Pay Day. It was the additional number of days in a calendar year that a Latina in this country would have to work to earn what a non-Hispanic white male earned on December 31st, 2023. So at the Latina Futures Lab, what's paramount to us is the narrative. We're now in an artificial intelligence election. The mis and disinformation of 2016 has evolved at nano speed. And so ultimately, what one of the things that I think is imperative here is that Latinas and women of color need to be at the table. They need to be shaping narratives and attitudes. And that's one of the things that we've done. We had a panel of experts, all women of color, Black, Asian American, Latina, early on to talk about gender and the role of gender in the presidential election. And the idea there is to platform the scientific experts in a conversation that is relevant, if not central, to this election and make them known. So, should there be any pickups in terms of frames, you're basing that on evidence and you're basing it from people that have that lived experience. On Thursday, Latina Futures, actually tomorrow, Latina Futures is going to have a webinar with Latina leaders that are mobilizing voters of color, first time voters, low propensity voters. We're doing this 2 weeks ahead of the election to capture and document the work, the effort, the leadership, not only this cycle, but previous cycles of Latinas in shaping and safeguarding our democracy. So, should any post election narrative want to undermine the work that was done, we have safeguarded that as a place of knowledge production, but also archiving. So, narrative's so important. The other thing that I think is really important is making sure that there's a central message that we can get behind. Whether people are partisan or not. And one is that in terms of gender equity, parity, you have to see women and people that identify as women as full human beings. They need to be afforded dignity. And that's especially true for our working female sisters. And for Latinas, what that means in this election is that Latinas are sophisticated political actors in American elections. And what that means is that their vote is important because their influence as a trusted messenger is important, and because their household formation is distinct from that of a more mature white electorate. There are oftentimes someone that's older or younger. You have a multi-generational household. You also have a different sphere of influence. Latinas also, like other women in American politics, participate and cast a ballot more than their male peers. And so should there be an investment, it should be on Latina voters. Now, the other thing that I think is paramount is around this messaging. So much has been said by Donald Trump and MAGA extremists about Latinidad. There is a difference going into 2024. And so while the xenophobia in the anti-immigrant frame continues, Donald Trump has integrated explicitly Latino Americans into his umbrella, his bigger tent. Now, part of the reason that that's a winning strategy is he's really able to talk to working class people in this country in ways that are distinguishable from what you could say Democratic political party leaders. Now, why that matters in terms of gender is precisely why October 3rd, 2024 was Latina Equal Pay Day. You have Latinas in this country who continue to be subjected to economic degradation in terms of wage inequality, whether it's annual earnings or hourly earnings. The difference for Latina households is that Latinas are the breadwinners. They're more likely to be segmented in occupational or professional occupations. So they also have higher educational attainment than their Latino peers, and that's been clear over the decades. If you have your breadwinner so severely underpaid, and we also have an incidence that is a global once in a lifetime incidence in COVID-19, where Latinas more than any other racial ethnic group left the labor force. You are impacting a youthful household in their economic prime. And so for me, thinking about a future, there is no future without Latina production. But the future that I think that I'm working on collaborating with so many others around is that there is a possibility with shared prosperity. And should Latinas be centered in our public policy making and in our psyche and imaginations, we'd all be better off.
Thank you so much for your framing and lifting up gender as one of the critical components we need to talk about in engagement in this election and every election cycle. Sonia, I was actually going to follow up this next question with you, but given that all of you have talked about this young electorate, I'd actually love to sort of open this question up to each of you. And Sonia, maybe you'd want to start with it. So a few weeks ago, the Albert Shanker Institute partnered with Share My Lesson to do a webinar for educators on alongside Generation Citizen on civic engagement and young voters. And it was really incredible. Just like, again, incredible speakers and great engagement from our webinar audience with Share My Lesson. And so I'm wondering if we could just take a moment for each of you to just reflect on what you are seeing from newer and younger Hispanic, Latina voters. What issues do you see driving them? Where are they? Where are they turning out? Why are they turning out? Again, Sonia, if you want to jump in, but
Yeah.
given that Camille and Clarissa named that young electorate too, I'd love to have all of you weigh in.
Yeah, the young electorate remains an untapped electorate in American politics. And so what's incumbent on all of us is, should we want to propel our democracy into something that elevates dignity for all, it has to also integrate in a meaningful way young people. And that is not only for policy relevance on issues like climate change and global warming, which young people lead and continue to drive, but also thinking about gun control. These are huge issues where young people have a very direct lived experience and are also mobilizing and enthusiastic around action, irrespective, right, of political party. That's true of climate change with the Republican young people, at least. Now, in terms of like this history and this arc, campaigns have finite resources, and there are entrenched interests over those resources. And there are also biases, both implicit and explicit, that tend to force those resources into a careful parameter of likely voters, voters with a long, lengthy voting history. And those are older white voters. And that's not indicative of our current democracy outside of the ballot box. And so I think that the role of schools, the role of educators, the role of interest groups like labor unions really have an opportunity to reject that trend or that status quo and integrate young people, even if it's their first time voting. And to the extent that you want to create a likely voter, that integration needs to be in culture, needs to be in language, it needs to resonate. And there also needs to be a direct call to action and some follow through. I think what we're lacking is an accountability. People honestly feel like government is not doing anything that solves their day to day. And everybody has to have a reality check and not argue with that, and start learning how we can work together and how other people can have serious power and influence over their daily lives. And I think it starts with young people.
That's fantastic. Camille, you had brought up that young electorate before. I also know that Voto Latino does a lot of work when it's not a presidential election year. Are there, in our webinar had focused as well on how important local and state races are, even though presidential election is taking a lot of the oxygen. What is that? What issues do you see driving young voters, and do you see an a work for an equal attention to those races that are not the presidential race or in addition to the presidential? Oh, mute again.
I want to answer the question in two parts. One is young voters are fearless, right? They're shocked, they're brave, they're fearless. They get at the edge of the cliff where us at the end are like, oh, I just remembered, I'm afraid of heights. I'm not jumping off that cliff, right? Like they need to be engaged on where they're at. They don't like policy wonk. They don't like numbers in that sense. They are actually very reactive voters to what is important to them, whether it's the issues around Palestine and Israel, whether it's the issues of the economy, whether it's issues of the student debt, whether it's an issue of being a dreamer or undocumented. All of that is extremely important to them. And that is how they vote. And they will tell you straight to your face that they don't like it. Right? If you're a teacher, you know this, right? Like the battle to be a teacher, right? To go back and forth and be like, you're a wisecrack. Well, they take that very seriously and they own it and they say what they feel. And I think, on and off elections, we forget that also young voters remember. They remember things that happen to them and they know who stands for them and they know who don't. And I think both institutions have real problems about taking them for granted, right? Because they think it's, again, as to Sonja's space here around Latino young voters, like we definitely spend more time talking to white voters, and the institutions are more white. Like, I don't know how else to say it, right? Like, like there is, and like I, as a, in the space of Voto Latino, I've seen it. As a consultant, I've seen it. I mean, like I can go on and on about why so many institutions will go to the white consultant to talk about Latino young voters, right? Like, it is absurd to me, right? And I've said this to Clarissa on and off at a drink. Like it is absurd to me. And and we ourselves perpetuate this in this white style type of, and I know this is shocking, but it's true. If we're going to talk about Hispanic heritage, if we're going to talk about churning the movement of voters, right, of young people and encouraging them, we have to meet them where they are. And so one of the things that Voto Latino does, is year round, is registering them and talking to them about issues. A lot of voters and donors for a lot of time didn't want to talk about immigration this year, didn't even want to fund immigration issues, right? Like, didn't want to talk about it. How can you not talk about immigration? Like literally, there's been families that have been ripped apart. There are families that have gone through an immense amount of pain. How do you not talk about that? Right? Because we're too afraid, because, the institutions don't want to invest in that. And I think it's important, and one of the things that I love about the organizations at this table right now is that we are leaning in. We're not afraid to talk about what's not important. I mean, I think that Unidos's letter to all the institutions about their lack of investment and engagement. Oh my God, chef kiss, how many calls I got from institutions asking why we signed on to that letter. Because it was important. Because you have not done what you need to do to engage Latinos. We are at the fight of our lives. Teachers cannot teach history, right? So like once this election is taking place, you're not going to be able to teach people in the classroom the issues of history, like where I learned about voting rights, where I learned how the political system worked, right? I learned how to debate my voice and make my voice strong as a young voter, how I learned to protest and be involved when I was a young voter. So I think, Voto Latino does year round. We engage really very much on issues. We talk to our partners like Unidos and other groups here. We partner with groups like the AFT and others to really try to address and use our platforms to now, because we're at a space now, even if the elections don't go the way many people want them to go, we're going to have to really pivot and use our electoral force in a different way, right? Because November 5th happens, and whatever happens after Election Day, what's going to happen is whether or not we're still going to have to fight for immigration. We're still going to have to fight for good jobs. We're still going to have to fight for contracts and ensure that our teachers get pay that they deserve, right? And that schools are fully funded. And if it goes the way that others, right, feel like, we're going to have to fight even more, right? And so that's sort of, I think, the kind of the crux of this. If we are really invested, we have to challenge the status quo and not be afraid.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Clarissa, you and a letter from Unidos USA was called out, but I'd love to give you the opportunity to just, whether it's talking about the young electorate, you want to follow up and include some of the work you and Unidos US is doing. I'd invite you to step in as well.
Yeah, the letter that Camille was referencing is a letter that we were joined by 14 other Latino sister organizations, a letter sent to the RNC and the DNC calling them out for their low levels of engagement with Hispanic voters, who are saying they would like to have more information to inform their voter choices. And challenge is a good word. I think that we need to also challenge our own assumptions, or at least test them, right? I am not prepared to write off Latino voters. I am not prepared to write off older or middle-aged Latino voters. In some ways, the strategies we pursue, to the extent that they are actually pursued, can also become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. So I think we have all heard rightfully so, by the way, for years about the role that Latinas play in the family unit and in how that family goes into society and engages with it. But I also want to make sure that we are testing if, to Sonia's point, right, if people who are interested in a particular outcome, it would make sense for them in this moment in time where there's no time to change the makeup of the pie to focus on Latina women. But since we're talking about here in the longer term, if we continue to do what we do, are we indeed then doing the same thing that the person at the door says? Nobody's ever come to talk to me. And so if the efforts on the progressive side are all about talking to Latinas, and I gotta say, the efforts are anemic. So I'm not saying they should stop, right? But if nobody's talking to Latino men, is it any wonder? Right? Is it any wonder? So I'm not prepared to write it off. And the reason I say that is because on many issues, actually, now that everybody's talking about Latinos are not a monolith, big revelation for some. The way it's usually talked about is actually as an undermining thing, right? Is like, well, Latinos are not a monolith. That means that there's no real strategy on how to talk to them. They don't agree on anything, and they're not a thing. And we are indeed incredibly diverse. That is what makes notable the fact that across subgroup, gender, age, on the top issues, we tend to have a lot of alignment on what we would like to see happen. And that's what gives me hope. And also, if for people who are not Latino and who may be wondering what's in it for me, that's great. What gives me hope is that I think Latinos generally tend to reject extremes and taking rights away from others. So for folks who may be wondering, like, what does tackling the Latino voter registration opportunity gap do for me, is it increases the ranks of people who, regardless of their personal belief, don't think that abortion should be illegal or that choice being taken away from others. That's a majority of Latino voters, of Latino Catholic voters, of Latino non-Catholic Christian voters, and of Latino men. It increases the ranks of people who believe that housing should be affordable, that wages should allow people to support a family. And so that's what gives me hope. And that's why I'm not giving up on any one of these folks. And again, I think we need to also figure out how to connect more at a gut level on economic issues with Latino voters and with the rest of the American electorate. Thank you so much for the chance to talk about that.
Thank you all. I'm so appreciative of all of you joining us tonight. And I want to hand it back to Evelyn De Jesus for some closing remarks, some reactions. But I'm going to wrap up quick round robin. I have ended during this election cycle. I have ended every webinar we've done with a question about what's your plan to vote, knowing that when someone has a voting plan, they are more likely to carry it out. And so just modeling for folks listening and folks who tune in on demand. So I would love to hear from any of you. What is your plan to vote this year?
I'll go, and I just think it's so fabulous to have, this Latina panel of experts. That's fantastic, and we need to do more of that day in and day out. I already voted, so I voted early. I encourage everybody to vote early and encourage everybody in their sphere of influence to ask what the voting plan is for those in their households, in their communities, and follow up on election day. And should you have a car and able to help drop off, do it all. Every vote counts.
Awesome. Who wants to go next?
I'll go next. I am voting early. I will be on the field on election day, so I will be taking my daughter to go vote early.
All right. And Clarissa, what is your
Well,
voting
for
plan this second?
For the first time in a long time, I think I'm actually going to be close to my voting location. And I love going in person when I can, which I haven't been able to do. So I'm looking forward to doing that this time.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing your voting plans and inspiring everyone else who is watching either tonight or on demand to make your own voting plan, and then see it through. And I like Sonia's example as well. Like if you have the opportunity to help someone else vote, do that too. And with that, Evelyn, let me hand it back to you for some closing remarks, reactions, and more motivation.
All right. So I just want to say, wow, wow, wow. I we should take this on the road, ladies. You ladies are guerreras. You're so informed. I'm writing all these data down. I'm like, I gotta go back and see this on demand. I want you to know I voted. I did the absentee ballot because I'm gonna be out of the country. So my husband and I voted. I have a grandson that's voting for the first time in college, and two granddaughters. They're already signed up. They got their ballots, and all my children. So there is a plan for the 3 generations, and we're not playing. So what I want to say is thank you. Muchas gracias, hermana Sonia, Clarissa, Camille, and my hermana Mary Catherine for doing this, especially honoring the Latina women, the Latina community. In the words of the great Dolores Huerta, every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person, a potential activist. Every minute, a chance to change the world. So let's change the world, my brothers and sisters. You will make the difference in this election. You and your tias and your tios and your abuelos and your comunidad, we're going to make that difference. So grab your heels, grab your pumps, your sneakers, your chancletas, everything you need to put on those feet, because whatever makes you comfortable, to run like hell and get people out to vote. We are not going back. No vamos a regresar a pasado. We will vote for freedom over extremism. Vamos a votar por la libertad y no por el odio. Let's ensure that our voices continue to be heard loud and clear in this election, as each one of my sisters have clearly articulated that. We are at the table. We're redesigning that table. We are not going to be ignored. Our voices are front and center. So let's send a strong message to the politicians that seek to divide us, those that empower bullies and want to silence our children, our familias, and who seek to erase us from the history books. We are here to stay. El voto es nuestra voz, because when we vote, we create a better future for ourselves, our family, y nuestra nación. Muchas gracias. God bless you guys. And let's get this done.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Gracias.
everyone. Have a great night. Good night to everyone who tuned in tonight and who is watching us on demand. Take care, and we'll see you at the polls.
Buenas noches. Voten, voten.